In this video, we're going to be making a simple converter or a calculator that takes a radius and calculates the volume of a sphere using JavaScript and HTML. This is going to be much like the temp converter that we did in the last video or last couple of videos. So if you have not seen those, I recommend checking those out. We're basically just going through the exact same process. And we're trying to build up repetition, on how to kind of create these little calculator pages. As always, I invite you to code along with me from scratch. Don't just watch the video or look at source code and think you got things figured out. So first thing I'm going to do is show you the end result. Right? We have welcome to Sphere Calculator, Sphere Volume Calculator. And as a student suggested, give us radius, we give you volume, as kind of a description about what this page or program does. And we see a label here and an input text box where I can put something, in theory, some type of number, hit calculate, and we get a volume that shows up. And I can enter a separate number if I want, and effectively hit calculate again, and I get a different volume. That's pretty nice. Something that's kind of new to this program or project is this placeholder, right? We did not do that in the last video. This is something I think is really nice. It's this gray text here, and maybe this is a better way or a different way to end up labeling it or kind of showing like a number format. Right, we could end up typing something as a placeholder text, maybe example 3.14. I don't know. Okay, so what I'm going to do is close this out. I am then going to delete it so that I'm on the same page that you are. I'm going to open up Visual Studio Code. And there's a couple of ways to get started. First thing we kind of want to do is make our project folder our working directory. And you can either hit open folder on the welcome screen or go to file, open folder. Notice I ain't got nothing there, so I'm going to do a new folder. I'm calling this one Sphere Volume. Once you have the folder named, you can select it. And that's going to set our working directory to Visual Studio Code. If I was to launch a new terminal, we're launching from that directory, right? That's kind of the whole reason we're doing this. But we're also making a folder to save all our code in and keep it organized. So I need to make some new files here. We'll start with our HTML file. I'm going to hit this new file icon, and we get the opportunity to name it. We're going to name it index.html. Okay. I'm going to create my HTML skeleton. Via the IntelliSense, I start typing out HTML, and we're going to hit this HTML:5 to create an HTML5 skeleton. We have all this HTML tags, the head, the body, already generated for us. So I highlighted, let me back that up, I highlighted my body and my head, and I tabbed them over. That's something I like to do to help keep it organized for me, right? This indentation kind of increases readability, arguably. So let's get started with editing the HTML aspect. Right away I see my title. My end results said something like Sphere Volume Calculator, so let's change that. This is effectively what shows up on the tab of in the window. I'm going to go ahead and throw in a heading, and we have these heading tags H1 through H6 give us different size headings, H1 actually being the largest. These are just pre-formatted elements that already exist. In the future, we'll end up probably kind of designing our own, right, and actually changing font styles or font sizes and creating tags like that. But we're going to say welcome to Sphere Volume Calculator, and we're excited about that. So we throw in an exclamation mark. Underneath that, I'm going to throw in a paragraph tag, and it's going to be kind of a description of our program. Give us radius or radius. We give you sphere volume. Sweet. Okay. Moving on through our HTML, we're going to have basically the input section, if you will. Right. I'm going to create this label, radius. It's just text. And then we're going to, right next to it, put our text box. Now, this is going to be an HTML element. It's going to be nested inside of these paragraph tags. And the only reason why I'm using this paragraph tag is to kind of section off this little bit of code, keep it separate from this. So we have radius. I'm going to create an input element. Now there's several different types, so we're going to need to define the type. I want the type in this case to be text. Now somebody earlier in my class, whenever we brought this up, indicated that there is number, and that may limit the data type to number. We ended up not testing it. I wish we would have, but I know text works for now. And then maybe your program, what it should do is text and then use JavaScript on the back end to verify that it is a number. I'm not sure the optimal route for this. I imagine if you do number, it basically enforces it on the front end inside the HTML, which could be nice. So we have input type equals text. And why don't we just pause there with that, and let's see what we got so far. So I'm actually going to run my HTML page in a browser. My favorite way to do this is to right click and do reveal in File Explorer. That's going to bring up a window here. Right? And we see index. My default browser is Chrome. So when I double click this bad boy, it's going to open it up in Chrome. We see welcome to Spherevolume Calculator. Give us radius, we give you sphere volume. Then we have radius, and we can type some stuff here, but that's about it. We're getting somewhere. Okay, I'm also going to want a button for sure. So this input just has the opening tag. Notice that our button has an opening and closing tag. The reason being is that we can actually type text here in between the tags, and that shows up on the button. I'm going to type calculate. Let's see what this looks like. My page is already open. I just need to refresh it in order to see the changes. Don't forget to save it in Visual Studio Code before you do this. But right here we see our button. It says calculate as predicted. I can click on it. Nothing really happens, but it exists. So we're getting somewhere. I'm kind of to the point where we're ready for our output, I guess. You can, again, section that off with a paragraph tag if you would like. And then here, we're going to basically show our volume. So I'm going to kind of put that volume tag. I'm going to save it again. I'm going to refresh my page, and you see volume down here, largely because I put it in its own paragraph tags, right? So each of these is a paragraph tag, which is kind of causing it to appear on a new line in my page. Okay, in the future, we're going to use something like div tags to make these a little bit more personalized and special. But for right now, I'm using existing HTML elements without having to dive too much into HTML. We're actually ready for the JavaScript part of this. And in a previous video, I talked about how we could use the script tags. Right? There's an opening and closing script, and anything that appears in between here is JavaScript directly embedded into our HTML. Now, in practice, people don't typically type their JavaScript here in the HTML file. In practice, what we tend to do is kind of segment our code and create separate files. What do I mean? I'm fat fingering some stuff here. So we can actually treat this almost like an import statement, where we say that it's going to effectively import or reference other code from a different file. Now, my file doesn't exist yet, but we're about to make it. And what we're going to call it is Spherevolume.js. Okay, so here in the opening script tag, we're creating a reference where we're saying our source, our src, is Spherevolume.js. It's going to be a JavaScript file. So instead of embedding the JavaScript directly in between these tags, I'm basically treating these as if they were like an import statement. I'm saying gain access to Spherevolume.js. Let's create that file now. Over here, where my new file icon, I'm going to click that. This is my favorite way to create a new file. There's others, but we're going to create Spherevolume.js. By using this new file icon, we get the opportunity to name the file, create it by hitting enter, and it's actually going to open in a new tab. So, as we saw in a previous video, we're going to have some code, and we're going to need to tell that section of code to execute. In order to basically tag a section of code, right, kind of modulize it and say, let's run this block or this section of code, we need to put it in a function. Function is another word for method. If you're used to hearing that word, procedure is also an older, dated term, but still possibly used. So we have function, calculate. Okay. This is a lot less complicated than, say, like a C++ or a Java function header or method header. And that's largely because JavaScript is a dynamically typed language. There's data types, but they don't matter when we're writing the code, right? Data types don't really matter at compile time. Data types matter at runtime when you actually execute it, okay? So what that means is our functions end up being pretty simplistic. The most notable thing being there's no return type. There's no specified data type that this function plans on returning, largely because it doesn't matter. It could be anything, right? In our case, we're not even returning anything. So there's not even the word void. Also, this particular function is not taking in any parameters. We're going to be able to just kind of pull and push the elements, or basically reference and edit the elements without actually passing them through. Let me show you what I mean. We're going to create a variable that is our radius. Now, you can kind of test this by trying to hard code values, but I'm going to jump straight to the crux of it, which is I want to pull this radius from this text box, right? Whenever we click this button, we're going to end up running this function. And what I want this function to do is to pull the radius from this text box. In order to do that, we need a way to refer to specifically this text box. I need to effectively give this text box a name. More specifically, I need to give it an ID. So we're going to give it an ID. Something like radius, right? Something like input. I think all these things work. Let's call it radius. Okay, so now that this has an ID, I can refer to it. I can refer to it here. And the way we are going to reference it is document. We're saying pull from the HTML document, get element by ID. In this case, the element, we just called it radius, and I want to pull the value out of that. All right, careful with the IntelliSense here. I don't want node value. I just want value. All right, so take the HTML document, get an element by ID. All of these things are elements, right? This is actually a head element, a body element. This is a H1 element, a paragraph element, a script element, right? These things are called elements. So we're going to get the element by ID, in this case radius, and now pull the value out of that element. That'll get us our radius from our HTML, which we're storing into a JavaScript variable. Now it's in my JavaScript code, and I can actually use it for some type of calculation. So why don't we plug in our volume of a sphere formula here, and I'm going to just Google that real fast to make sure we get it right. Volume of a sphere. And that is, there's a calculator here, which is actually going to be nice because we can cross-reference, we can test our program to make sure it works, but we see 4/3 pi r cubed, okay? 4/3 pi r cubed. 4/3 pi. Now you could type 3.14, but we can get more accurate with that. If you're familiar with Java, this is going to be pretty straightforward and easy, but we need to find math methods, right? So I'm going to Google math API JavaScript. Our first link here, math JavaScript. This is coming from Mozilla's developer website, but this gives me, there's a class called math. In this case, they're saying it is a built-in object, and it has a lot of functions, a lot of methods. We see the word methods. I think this is interesting that we say methods here and then function in our JavaScript, but these are advanced math things. Things like cosine, right? Here's cosine. For instance, sine is down here. We can random numbers. We can round off numbers. We can find the maximum or minimum between two numbers. What I'm most interested in is this right here, math.pi. Notice there's no parentheses here. This is not a method. This is a, as they say, static property. This value pi is stored in the math class or the math object, so we are going to pull it out and use it in our program. We can do so by saying math.pi. Right, so this is pi to some number of decimal positions, and we're going to get, it's so much more precise than just plugging in like 3.14 or even going like 5 digits deep. It's way more precise than that. So we're going to do 4/3 times math.pi times, now the next thing I need to do in order to get my volume is our radius cube. Now we could type it out 3 times, right? I could say something like radius times radius times radius. Okay, imagine if we have a much larger power. You can see why that is just not a good idea. Well, as it turns out, the math class also provides a method, math.pal, that will allow us to calculate these exponents, right? Math.pal, this is a method. We see the parentheses, which is a dead giveaway. We're going to supply it 2 arguments or 2 parameters, a base and an exponent, right? To kind of see some examples or some up here, they're doing math.pal on 7, 3. So this is 7 to the 3rd power, which should give us 343. We effectively want to use this method, but we want to use it in context with what we got going on. We want our radius cubed. So we're going to do math.pal times radius, that's our base, 3. That is our exponent. Okay, I'm not worried about truncation here. If you don't know what truncation is, don't worry about it. But if you do know what truncation is, you don't have to worry about it because there's only one numeric data type in JavaScript, and it's number. There's no differentiation between ints or doubles, so we're good to go here. This should work, right? This is going to calculate my volume of a sphere using radius, this JavaScript variable which we pulled from our HTML document. That result is stored in volume. So in order to see it, we could console.log it. Why don't we try that? Why don't we console.log, and then we'll worry about actually rendering it to the page. So I'm going to console.log volume. Okay, if I rerun my page, I'm going to plug in a radius here, 4. I'm going to hit calculate. Some of you may be thinking, oh, there's a console.log, so it's in Visual Studio Code. No. We actually talked about in a previous video how you can log stuff to the console through the HTML, and it gets shoved here in the console in theory, right? If I right click and I do inspect, there's a console tab. Here I'm in Chrome, and you could in theory see the stuff that's there, and it's not there either, even though I'm telling it to execute, except I'm not telling it to execute just yet. I'm going to flip back to Visual Studio Code, and we have this sweet calculate formula. I'm just never ever telling it to execute. I want it to execute whenever I hit this button, but as of right now it is not. In order to tell this button to execute this specific function, I'm going to say button on click calculate with some parentheses. Right? Whenever this button is clicked, execute calculate. That's the name of this function, which is found in Spherevolume.js, and our HTML knows to find that, or can find that I should say, because we effectively imported our Spherevolume.js. Right? We're using this script tag almost like it's an import. We're saying gain access to this file. There we can hit calculate and it'll be able to find it. Let's try this out now. I'm going to refresh my page. I'm going to punch in 4. Notice I got my console already up and ready to go. I hit calculate, and boom, it's showing up in the console. Is that even right? Let's test it in the Google. Here they're looking for a radius. I'm going to hit 4. We get 268.08. Here we get 268.08, and ours is even more accurate. Booyah. Okay, So that's cool. It's showing up in the console. It's showing up in the log there. I want it to show up next to this volume. Right? So if I flip back to my index, here I've got this sweet paragraph tag. And right now it says volume. And I ultimately want my number to show up next to it. So what I'm going to do is tag this paragraph with an ID. Right? I'm going to say the ID of this is output, or the ID of this is volume, something like that. Now I have a way to reference this paragraph. I'm going to flip back to my JS, and instead of doing a console.log, I'm just going to comment that out. I want to update the HTML itself. I want to basically change this element to include my volume. Well, we can do that in a very similar manner to this. I can take the HTML document. I can get an element by an ID. We just tagged that paragraph tag with volume. And what I want to do is, what do I want to do? Change the inner HTML of that to be volume. Right? Volume here is referring to this variable that we created, the result of our calculation. So I'm going into the HTML document, I'm getting an element by an ID. The ID is volume, and I'm changing what's inside of that element, right? The inner HTML. I'm changing that to be volume, not in quotes. We're referring to the variable, which is the result of my calculations. Let's try this out. I'm back here, I'm going to refresh. I'm going to enter a volume. I'm going to hit calculate, and boom, we're getting it here and not the console. That's pretty sweet. I would, however, like it to still say volume, right? I ended up replacing the text because what we're doing is we're saying the inner HTML becomes this. Forget what was there. It becomes this. Okay? There's a couple of different ways to do this. What we have found, what I kind of like the most, is that we just kind of replicate that volume tag here. Right, so I'm leaving the volume here because when we first load the page, keep in mind my JavaScript has not executed, right? That's what allows this to show up. The fact that I can see volume here on the initial load is because it's here. Kind of like that. However, I was losing it whenever I was executing the HTML. And now we are replacing it by basically replicating that volume thing again. There's different ways to go about this. I know if you've a little bit better versed in HTML or CSS or something like that, you know that you got a better way of doing this, and that's fine. But this is where we're at right now. But that's essentially it. Other than that placeholder value, I would like to kind of add that in. It's a neat little flourish, I guess, to our program. I'm back in the HTML. Here's our input text box. And so it's going to be one of these properties that is shoved in the angle brackets. That is going to be placeholder. And whatever you type here is going to end up showing up there in the text box, in this case, as gray text. Enter a radius here. We are excited about everything. Hence the exclamation mark. If I refresh, and there's that placeholder text. That's nice, especially if you have a number format. Imagine that we're doing like a date and you want like forward slashes. You can kind of put an example here and people can type over it. That seems super awesome. This has been Sphere Volume Calculator. I'll see you in the next one.